here he is, 120, and he's, out maneuvering and out walking everybody else. By all normal indications of health and fitness, Moses should have lived even longer. From a natural perspective, Moses died too soon. He died too young because he was so healthy when he died. From our perspective, he still had things to do. After all, Israel was not yet in the promised land. Moses still had a task. He was still needed. And from our perspective, Moses died too young. But from God's perspective, Moses died right on schedule. He died right at the appropriate time. I think we can take comfort in the fact that God not only knows the details of our lives, He also knows the end of the details. God not only knows all of our days, He knows the end of our days. And so for us, there's no reason why we should be afraid when we board an airplane, when we drive down the freeways. There's no reason to fret or worry as you sit in a doctor's office when you wait for tests to come back. Because God knows all the details of our lives, including the day of our departure. Amen. And from our perspective, Moses may have died too young, but from God's perspective, he was right on schedule. Moses died at just the right time. Moses may have died alone, but he died securely. He entered the presence of his Lord, where he would never again commit another sin. He would never again make another mistake. He would never give in anymore to anger. He would never suffer unjust criticism. He would never suffer sorrow or disappointment. My mother, father, and brother are all buried in Southern California, but they're in 3 different cemeteries. And when my mother passed away in 2005, it left me as the last of my family. And so after the funeral, I visited each one of their graves in the various cemeteries because I wanted to pay my respects, to reflect on their contributions to my life, and to close that particular chapter in my life. You can't do that with Moses, because nobody knows where Moses is buried. You can't find his grave, which is probably a good thing, because we would have turned it into another shrine. We would have made it another Mecca. And yet God is the only one who knows where the body is buried. The first lesson that we can learn from the death of Moses is that Moses died the same way he lived. He died climbing. He died believing the promises of God. He died in the presence of God. The second lesson we can learn from his death is that Moses died at just the right time. From a natural perspective, it was way too soon. But from God's perspective, it was right on schedule. The third lesson we can learn from the death of Moses is that, like Moses, we are all expendable. No one is indispensable when it comes to God's plan. Look at verses 8 and 9. The people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded. Israel mourned for 30 days following the death of Moses. Today, the heirs have the estate sectioned out by the end of the month. But that wasn't the case with Moses. The people were still in mourning 30 days later. But yet, when the time of mourning was done, it was time for Israel to get going again. God still had promises to keep. Israel still had places to go. I find it interesting that, like most great leaders, Moses was not appreciated until he was dead. Isn't it ironic that it usually takes a leader leaving or dying before we recognize what a good gift they are to us? Well, Moses knew he was expendable. And based on the instructions that God had given him, Moses recognized that his time on earth was short. And so according to Numbers chapter 27, verses 12 through 23, Moses trained his own successor Joshua. There are some leaders who are threatened by the up-and-coming emerging leaders. Moses was a man who loved to invest in them, and he trained his own successor. You see, Moses was a shepherd at heart. And he knew that one day he would be gone, but he wanted to make sure that Israel was not left as a group of sheep without a shepherd. And so he mentored Joshua. He trained him. He prepared him. He made sure that Israel had a trained, prepared, proven leader when the time came. And when the timing was right, when the day of his death drew near, Moses commissioned Joshua publicly in sight of all of Israel and handed over the baton of leadership to him, and then stepped out of the way so Joshua could take over. You know, God's plan does not depend on anyone for all time. But it does depend on each of us to serve God at a certain time. God gave Moses a specific task to carry out. And Moses was faithful to carry out that task. What task has God given you? And are you carrying it out and doing what God has called you to do? Well, the first lesson that we can learn from the death of Moses is that Moses died just the way he lived. He died climbing. He died believing God's promises. He died in the presence of God. The second lesson we can learn is that Moses died at the right time. For us, it may have seemed untimely, but for God, it was right on schedule. It was right on time. The third lesson that we can learn from the death of Moses is that no one is indispensable when it comes to God's plan. God's plan does not depend on anyone for all times, but for all to serve Him at a certain time. And Moses' epitaph is recorded in verses 10 through 12. There's not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. You know, Moses was unique among all the prophets of Israel. Most prophets got to know God through secondary sources, through visions or dreams or through the writings, through Scripture. Moses was unique in the fact that he was allowed into God's very presence. And he knew God face to face. As impressive as all of his accomplishments were, the most important thing about Moses was his relationship with God. Moses knew God. Well, more so than most people, Moses was able to follow God's leading. Now, granted, it helped that there was a pillar of cloud, present every day for 40 years that directed him through the wilderness. But I think at the end of his life that Moses could look back on all of his days and recognize that God had led him every step of the way. So please stand and take your hymnal and turn to hymn number 461. We will close our service this morning by singing the hymn, He Leadeth Me.